Welcome back to the channel. Today we drift into a chapter of history that is often romanticized, but rarely told honestly. A world of dust, desperation, and broken promises hidden behind the glitter of gold. Before we begin, take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who loves real history, and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the stories the past tried to forget. Let's step into the Wild West and discover why it truly sucked to be a gold miner. They called it opportunity, but it arrived disguised as a rumor. A whisper that crossed oceans, jumped mountains, and crept into kitchens and barns, into taverns and churches. Gold, not a little of it, mountains of it, rivers so rich you could scoop fortune from the mud with your bare hands. A man could be poor in the morning and wealthy by nightfall. That was how the story was told, again and again, until it stopped sounding like fantasy and began to feel like destiny. In the middle of the 19th century, the world was already hard. For many men, life offered little more than endless labor and inherited poverty. Farms barely fed families. Factory work crushed bodies for pennies. Debt followed people like a shadow. So when news broke that gold had been found in the West, it didn't just promise wealth, it promised escape. Escape from bosses, from landlords, from the slow certainty that tomorrow would look exactly like today. Newspapers fueled the fire. Editors printed exaggerated accounts of easy riches, knowing full well that sensational headlines sold copies. A single gold flake became a chunk the size of a fist. A lucky strike by one man became proof that success was inevitable for all. Illustrations showed smiling miners standing beside overflowing sacks of gold, clean-shaven, well-fed, triumphant. What they did not show were the thousands who found nothing at all. Word of mouth was even worse. Men returning east for brief visits told stories that grew larger with every retelling. They spoke of freedom, of wide-open land, of riches waiting for anyone brave enough to claim them. Failures stayed quiet. No one wanted to admit that they had risked everything and lost. Silence protected pride, and silence kept the myth alive. Soon, the idea of gold became unstoppable. Men sold farms their families had worked for generations. They borrowed money they could never repay. Some abandoned wives and children with nothing but a promise to return rich. Others left quietly in the night, ashamed of their desperation but unable to resist the pull of the dream. Entire towns thinned out as able-bodied men vanished westward chasing the same illusion. The journey itself already hinted at the lie. Reaching the goldfields was expensive, exhausting, and dangerous. Some traveled by wagon across plains where disease, accidents, and starvation were constant threats. Others took ships around South America, enduring months at sea in overcrowded, filthy conditions. Many never even made it to the mines. They died along the way, victims of storms, illness, or simple miscalculation. But those who survived the journey believed the suffering was temporary. They told themselves it would all be worth it once they reached the rivers. Hardship became proof that they deserved success. Pain became an investment. Every mile traveled strengthened the belief that fate owed them something in return. When miners finally arrived, reality hit fast and hard. The goldfields were already crowded. Thousands of men had come before them, and thousands more arrived every month. The best land, the richest streams, the most promising hillsides had been claimed early on. These claims were fiercely guarded, sometimes with guns. Latecomers found themselves pushed to the margins, forced to work land that had already been picked over, scraped clean by earlier waves of miners. But leaving was unthinkable. Turning back meant admitting failure, not just to others but to oneself. Men who had sold everything could not return empty-handed. Pride became a prison. Hope, once so bright, turned into a chain that kept them digging long after reason said to stop. The belief that hard work guaranteed success was perhaps the cruelest lie of all. Mining was not a meritocracy. It did not reward effort fairly. A man could labor for years and find nothing, while another stumbled across a lucky strike on his first day. Skill mattered far less than chance, but chance does not care how desperate you are. Still, the miners clung to the idea that persistence would eventually be rewarded. They told each other stories of men who almost quit until the day before they struck gold. These stories spread like folklore, convincing countless miners to stay just a little longer, to dig one more trench, to survive one more winter. Behind the optimism was fear. Fear of returning home broke and humiliated. Fear of facing the people who had believed in them, or worse, the people who had warned them not to go. Fear of discovering that the dream had never been real at all. The West itself amplified the illusion. Wide landscapes created a sense of endless possibility. Rivers seemed infinite. Mountains looked untouched. It was easy to believe that wealth must be hiding somewhere, just beyond the next bend, just below the next layer of soil. The vastness of the land made failure feel temporary, even when it wasn't. But competition was relentless. Every promising spot attracted dozens of men. Claims overlapped. Arguments erupted daily. The lack of clear law meant disputes were settled through intimidation or violence. A man could lose his claim overnight simply because someone stronger decided to take it. Even those who found gold lived in constant fear of losing it. Supplies were expensive and often poor in quality. Merchants knew miners were desperate and charged accordingly. Shovels broke, pans bent, tools failed when they were needed most. Everything cost more than it should have, draining any small gains a miner managed to make. Yet hope refused to die. It lingered in campfire conversations, in rumors of new discoveries, in the sight of a single shiny fleck caught in the sunlight. That fleck, no matter how small, was enough to reignite belief, enough to convince a man that tomorrow would be different. The dream of gold wasn't just about money, it was about identity. To strike gold meant becoming someone new, successful, respected, free. It meant proving that you were not ordinary, not trapped, not destined for a life of obscurity. That emotional promise was powerful enough to override hunger, exhaustion, and common sense. And so the miners stayed. They stayed when logic said to leave. They stayed when their bodies broke down. They stayed when the land gave nothing back, because the dream had become part of who they were. Abandoning it felt like erasing themselves. What they did not yet fully understand was that the dream had been designed to keep them digging, designed to keep them believing, designed to keep them trapped in a cycle where hope replaced reason and endurance replaced success. By the time many realized the truth, it was already too late. The dream that had drawn them west had transformed into something darker, an obligation to suffer in silence, to keep chasing a promise that grew thinner with every passing day. This was how it began, not with greed alone, but with belief, with trust in stories that sounded just plausible enough to be true, with the desperate need to believe that somewhere, in that endless western land, a better life was waiting. And once that belief took hold, letting go was far harder than leaving home ever had been. Gold mining did not begin with discovery, it began with exhaustion, the kind that settled into bones and never fully left. From the moment a miner woke up, his body was already behind, already aching from the day before. Dawn brought no sense of renewal, only the knowledge that the same punishment was about to begin again. There were no days off, no safe pace, no gradual easing into the work. Survival demanded constant motion, and the land punished hesitation. Most miners had never done labor like this before. Farming was hard, factory work was brutal in its own way, but mining was something else entirely. It demanded strength, endurance, and repetition beyond reason. Shovels bit into gravel and clay for hours at a time. Pickaxes rang against stone until arms went numb. Dirt was hauled, dumped, and hauled again, sometimes thousands of pounds in a single day, all for the chance that a few glittering specks might appear in the pan. The work followed the sun because it had to. Daylight was precious. From the first pale light of morning until dusk swallowed the camps, men labored without pause. Meals were rushed or skipped entirely. Water breaks were rare. Every moment spent resting felt like money slipping away. The land rewarded obsession, not balance, and it trained men quickly to ignore pain. Hands suffered first. Skin split open from constant friction. Blisters hardened, then tore again. Fingers swelled and cracked until blood stained the tools. There were no gloves designed for this kind of work, and even if there had been, few could afford them. Many miners wrapped their hands in scraps of cloth or old rags, but these soaked through quickly, becoming stiff with dirt and blood. The back followed. Endless bending, lifting, and twisting ground spines down over time. Men developed stoops that never straightened again. A sudden slip on wet rock could ruin a body permanently. There were no safety regulations, no compensation, no recovery time. An injured miner was simply a miner who could no longer work, and therefore could no longer eat. And always there was water. Ice-cold, numbing, merciless water. Placer mining required standing in rivers for hours, even during winter. Boots filled. Legs went numb. Feet lost feeling entirely. Some men tied ropes around their waists to keep from being swept away by currents swollen with snowmelt. Others simply trusted their balance and hoped for the best. Cold was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Prolonged exposure led to frostbite, infections, and long-term damage. Toes turned black, fingers stiffened permanently. A man could lose parts of himself slowly, almost unnoticed, until one day they were simply gone. Winter transformed the land into an enemy. Snow buried camps overnight, paths disappeared, supplies froze solid, fires became difficult to maintain as wet wood refused to burn, tents collapsed under weight they were never meant to bear. Some miners slept sitting up because lying down meant waking up unable to feel their legs. The cold crept into everything. It numbed pain but deepened damage. Wet clothes froze stiff on bodies, beards iced over. Breath turned to frost in the air. Men woke to find their boots frozen solid, requiring fire to soften them enough to wear. Even then, putting them on meant forcing swollen, damaged feet into unyielding leather. Summer offered no relief, only a different kind of suffering. Heat baked the land until the ground cracked. Dust filled lungs and eyes. Rivers shrank, concentrating waste and disease. Insects swarmed everywhere, drawn by sweat, food scraps, and open wounds. Flies gathered in thick clouds, crawling across faces and settling into cuts. The sun punished exposed skin relentlessly. Many miners developed burns so severe they peeled in layers. Shade was rare. Wide-brimmed hats helped little. Dehydration crept up silently, weakening men until dizziness led to mistakes. Falls, slips, crushed fingers, broken bones. And the terrain never stayed predictable. One day a hillside might seem stable. The next, after rain or careless digging, it could collapse without warning. Cave-ins were common and often fatal. A wall of earth weighing tons could bury a man in seconds. Rescue was difficult, sometimes impossible. Many bodies were never recovered, entombed in the very ground they had hoped would make them rich. There were no machines to ease the burden, especially in the early years. Everything was done by hand. Wheelbarrows, when available, were crude and often broke under load. Water wheels and sluices helped some, but these required materials, engineering knowledge, and luck, things most miners lacked. For the majority, progress came one shovelful at a time. Sleep was poor and never enough. Camps were noisy, crowded, and exposed to the elements. Rain soaked bedding. Cold crept through thin fabric, wind howled through gaps. Men woke repeatedly during the night, either from discomfort or fear. Fear of theft, fear of animals, fear of violence. Even rest demanded vigilance. The land itself seemed to resist being worked. Hardpan layers stopped shovels cold. Rocks shattered tools, roots tangled progress, streams flooded without warning. Nature did not yield easily, and every victory felt temporary. A promising site could dry up overnight or collapse into useless rubble. Tools failed constantly, picks snapped, shovels bent, pans cracked. Repairs were improvised and unreliable. Replacement tools were expensive and often unavailable. A broken tool could halt work for days, pushing a miner closer to hunger. Every clang of metal against stone carried not just effort, but risk. And beneath it all was the knowledge that none of this guaranteed anything. A man could endure the worst conditions imaginable and still find nothing. Sweat did not summon gold. Pain did not attract it. The earth remained indifferent, unmoved by sacrifice. This uncertainty gnawed at the mind. Physical labor was exhausting, but mental strain was worse. Each empty pan was a judgment. Each day without success chipped away at belief. Yet quitting felt impossible. To stop meant admitting that all the suffering had been for nothing. The land isolated men not just geographically, but emotionally. Vast distances separated camps from towns. Supplies arrived late or not at all. Help was rarely nearby. If something went wrong, there was often no one to turn to. Self-reliance was not a virtue, it was a requirement enforced by circumstance. Weather changed without warning. Clear mornings turned into violent storms by afternoon. Rain transformed dry ground into mud that swallowed boots and wagons. Lightning struck exposed ridges. Floodwaters swept away equipment, camps, and sometimes people. Nature reminded miners constantly that they were guests, not masters. The land also stripped away illusions quickly. Romantic ideas of adventure collapsed under the weight of repetition. Day after day of the same movements, the same aches, the same disappointments. There were no heroic moments, only endurance, no triumphs, only survival. Some men adapted, their bodies hardening into something almost unrecognizable. Others broke down, limps became permanent, coughs deepened, eyes dulled, faces aged rapidly, weathered by sun and wined into lines far older than their years, and still they worked, because stopping meant hunger, because stopping meant shame, because the land had taught them a cruel lesson early on, that mercy was not coming. The Wild West was not a backdrop for ambition. It was a test of endurance that few were prepared to pass. It took strength not just to labor, but to continue believing that the labor mattered. The environment did not reward hope. It only responded to force, and even then, it rarely gave anything back. By the end of each day, men collapsed into their shelters not with satisfaction, but with dread. Tomorrow promised the same suffering, the same uncertainty. Sleep offered no comfort, only a brief escape from pain. This was the reality of the work, not adventure, not freedom. Just a relentless struggle against a land that offered nothing easily and took everything eagerly. Hunger crept in quietly at first, almost politely, as if it didn't want to be noticed. It began as a dull ache, a constant reminder that food was never quite enough. In the gold camps, eating was not about nourishment or pleasure. It was about survival, and even that was never guaranteed. Most miners arrived with limited supplies, and whatever they brought disappeared quickly. The land did not provide food the way it promised gold. Hunting was unreliable, farming nearly impossible, and fresh provisions depended entirely on supply lines that were slow, expensive, and often broken. What miners ate day after day would be unrecognizable as a proper diet. Salted pork, tough as leather. Hardtack biscuits so dense they had to be soaked in water. Or coffee, just to be chewed. Beans, when available, cooked endlessly to soften them enough to swallow. Everything tasted of smoke, dirt, or salt. Fresh fruits and vegetables were rare luxuries, priced far beyond what most miners could afford as weeks turned into months' bodies weakened from deficiencies they did not yet understand. Scurvy crept in next. Gums bled, teeth loosened, old wounds reopened. Men felt exhausted no matter how much they rested. Their skin grew pale, their eyes dull. They blamed the work, the cold, the stress, anything but the food, because there was nothing else to eat anyway. The knowledge of vitamins and nutrition was decades away. To the miner, sickness felt random, cruel, and unavoidable. Water, which should have been the simplest necessity, became another threat. Rivers served as lifelines and death traps at the same time. Miners drank from the same streams they used for washing clothes, cleaning tools, and dumping waste. Upstream camps emptied their refuse directly into the water. Human waste, animal carcasses, rotting food, all of it flowed downstream to the next group of desperate men. Cholera thrived in these conditions. It struck suddenly and without mercy. A man could appear healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. Violent diarrhea, vomiting, dehydration so severe the body collapsed inward on itself. Camps were powerless to stop it. There were no quarantines, no understanding of bacteria, no effective treatments. Fear spread faster than the disease itself. Men avoided each other, yet still drank from the same poisoned water. Dysentery was slower, but just as deadly. It weakened men over weeks, draining strength until they could no longer work. For a miner, being unable to work was often a death sentence. No work meant no gold. No gold meant no food. Sick men were not cared for. They were tolerated until they became a burden, then quietly abandoned. Medical care in the goldfields was primitive at best and non-existent at worst. Doctors were few, expensive, and often untrained. Many were little more than men with basic tools and confidence. Treatments ranged from ineffective to actively harmful. Bloodletting was still common. Mercury-based medicines poisoned as often as they cured. Alcohol was prescribed for nearly everything, from pain to infection to despair. A simple cut could become fatal. Tools slipped, sharp rocks sliced skin, blisters opened and festered. Without proper cleaning, bacteria thrived. Infection set in quickly. Redness turned to swelling. Swelling turned to fever. Fever turned to delirium. By the time a man realized how serious it was often too late. Amputation, when attempted, was crude and terrifying, performed without proper anesthesia. Many did not survive the procedure. Typhoid fever, pneumonia, tuberculosis, diseases that thrived in crowded, unsanitary conditions, swept through camps regularly. Tents packed closely together offered little ventilation. Smoke from fires filled the air. Damp bedding never fully dried. Coughs echoed through the night, each one a reminder that illness was everywhere and unavoidable. Hygiene was a luxury few could afford. Clean clothes were rare. Bathing meant entering freezing rivers or using scarce water better saved for drinking. Lice spread quickly, burrowing into seams of clothing and hair. Fleas infested bedding. Rats scavenged camps at night, spreading disease while miners slept. Death became familiar, too familiar. Graves appeared on the edges of camps, marked with simple wooden boards if they were marked at all. Some had names scratched into them, many did not. Funerals were brief if they happened at all. Work could not stop for mourning. The living needed to eat. The psychological toll of constant illness and death was immense. Men watched friends waste away, powerless to help. They learned not to get too close to anyone because closeness meant loss. Empathy became a liability. Emotional numbness became a survival mechanism. Alcohol filled the gaps where medicine failed. Whiskey was cheap, widely available, and aggressively sold. It dulled pain, both physical and emotional. It warmed the body, or at least made the cold easier to ignore. It helped men sleep when fear and coughing would not. But it also destroyed health even faster. Liver disease, addiction, violence, all flourished in its wake. Many miners drank to forget hunger, others drank to forget failure. Some drank simply because there was nothing else to do. Saloons became central fixtures of camp life, not as places of joy, but as places of escape. The hangovers worsened dehydration. Judgment faltered. Accidents increased. Fights turned deadly. Mental health collapsed quietly. Depression went unnamed. Anxiety was constant. Some men stopped caring whether they lived or died. They took reckless risks, worked in dangerous conditions, ignored injuries. A part of them hoped the land would make the decision for them. Sleep offered little relief. Fever dreams blurred into waking hallucinations. Men shivered through nights soaked in sweat. The sound of coughing, groaning, and vomiting filled camps after dark. Morning revealed who had survived the night and who had not. Supplies that could have prevented much of this suffering, fresh food, clean water, basic sanitation, existed in the world, but not in the goldfields. Transport was slow and costly. Merchants prioritized profit over health. Miners had no leverage. They paid what they could or went without. As illness spread, productivity fell. As productivity fell, desperation increased. Desperation led to poor decisions, drinking bad water, eating spoiled food, working while sick. The cycle fed itself relentlessly. Even those who survived carried lasting damage. Teeth lost to scurvy never returned. Lungs scarred by pneumonia never fully healed. Digestive systems ruined by years of poor food caused lifelong pain. The gold rush aged men rapidly, turning 20-year-olds into something closer to 40 before their time. Death was not dramatic. It was slow, messy, and lonely. Many men died far from family, buried by strangers or not buried at all. Their dreams ended not in riches but in sickness brought on by neglect, ignorance, and indifference. And through it all, the camps continued to function. Shovels kept moving, rivers kept flowing. New arrivals replaced the dead almost immediately, unaware of what awaited them. The system did not pause to reflect. It consumed men steadily, efficiently, without remorse. This was the hidden cost of the gold rush. Not just broken bodies, but bodies eaten from the inside by hunger and disease. Not sudden catastrophe, but slow decay. The land did not need to kill miners quickly. It simply needed to wear them down, day by day, until they could no longer stand. By the time many realized that gold was not the greatest danger they faced, their bodies were already too weak to escape. Law did not arrive with the miners. It stayed behind, somewhere east, where towns had names, borders, and institutions that pretended to protect people. What came west instead was something far older and far cruder, raw human instinct sharpened by desperation. In the gold camps, order was not established. It was negotiated daily, often violently, and always temporarily. Every man understood one thing very quickly: no one was coming to save you. The camps were built overnight and vanished just as fast. Thousands of men crowded into makeshift settlements of tents, shacks, and lean-tos hammered together from scrap wood and canvas. These were not towns in any meaningful sense. They had no governing bodies, no consistent rules, no enforcement beyond what men could impose themselves. When disputes arose, and they arose constantly, there was no neutral authority to appeal to. Justice was whatever the strongest, loudest, or most feared group decided it was. Gold intensified everything. It turned ordinary disagreements into life or death conflicts. A shovel left unattended could spark a fight. A footprint too close to another man's claim could end in bloodshed. Every miner lived with the knowledge that what he worked for could be taken from him at any moment, and that the system offered no protection at all. Claim jumping was the most common source of violence. Mining claims were often poorly marked, if they were marked at all. A few wooden stakes, a line scratched into dirt, maybe a scrap of paper tacked to a post. These were the fragile symbols meant to represent ownership. In a land flooded with desperate men, those symbols meant very little. A claim was only yours if you could defend it. Men left camps for supplies or rest and returned to find strangers working their land. Sometimes the intruders claimed ignorance. Other times they didn't bother pretending. Arguments followed predictable patterns: shouting, threats, fists, knives, guns. The outcome depended not on who was right, but on who remained standing. Firearms were everywhere. Revolvers hung from belts as naturally as tools. Rifles leaned against tent walls. Knives were carried openly. Weapons were not signs of aggression, they were symbols of survival. A man without one was announcing weakness. In a place without law, deterrence was often the only safety. Disputes escalated quickly because there was no reason for restraint. No courts meant no trials, no prisons meant no sentences. Punishment was immediate, public, and often irreversible. A man accused of theft might be beaten unconscious, or worse, before he had a chance to speak. Crowds formed fast, fueled by fear and anger. Once a mob decided someone was guilty, mercy rarely followed. Lynchings were disturbingly common. a rope thrown over a tree branch, a barrel kicked away, a body left hanging as a warning. These executions were framed as justice, but they were closer to collective panic. They served less to uphold order and more to remind everyone how fragile life was in the camps. The message was clear: step out of line, and this could be you. Even those who avoided direct conflict lived under constant threat. Theft was rampant. Gold dust was easy to steal and hard to trace. Men slept lightly, clutching weapons or hiding their earnings in places they hoped no one would think to look. Some sewed gold into their clothes, others buried it secretly, praying they would remember where. Many lost everything overnight. Trust was dangerous. Partnerships formed out of necessity, but they were always fragile. A partner could disappear with shared gold at any time. Loyalty lasted only as long as conditions allowed. Hunger, alcohol, and fear eroded bonds quickly. Men learned to watch even those they worked beside every day. Saloons became hotspots of violence. Alcohol loosened tongues and tempers. Grievances that had simmered all day exploded after dark. Card games ended in accusations of cheating. Insults escalated into brawls. Brawls turned into shootings. Broken furniture and blood-stained floors were routine. Some saloons kept coffins nearby, knowing they would be needed. There was no consistent racial or cultural peace either. The goldfields drew people from around the world: Europeans, Latin Americans, Chinese immigrants, Native Americans, African Americans, and others, all thrown together without structure or protection. Prejudice flourished unchecked. Foreign miners were targeted, blamed, attacked, and driven off claims through intimidation and violence. Chinese miners in particular faced relentless hostility. They were often pushed onto the worst land, taxed unfairly, assaulted, and robbed. Laws, when they did appear, were usually written to exclude or exploit them. Violence against them was rarely punished, reinforcing the idea that some lives mattered less than others. Native populations suffered even worse. The gold rush invaded their lands without consent, destroying ecosystems they depended on. When they resisted, they were met with overwhelming violence. Camps saw indigenous people not as neighbors, but as obstacles. Massacres occurred with little consequence, written off as necessary or ignored entirely. Reputation became a form of armor. A man known to be dangerous was less likely to be challenged. Some cultivated fear deliberately, responding to minor slights with excessive force. Violence became performative, a way to establish status. The quieter, more cautious men often suffered the most, seen as easy targets. There were attempts at order. Vigilance committees formed in some camps, made up of miners who claimed to enforce rules and protect property. In practice, these groups often acted as another source of terror. They decided guilt and punishment without oversight. Personal grudges slipped easily into their decisions. Power corrupted quickly. Even success brought danger. A miner who struck gold became a target immediately. Word spread fast. Suddenly, strangers watched him closely. Offers of partnership appeared out of nowhere. Thieves followed him. Violence did not spare the lucky. It hunted them. Many successful miners fled camps quietly, leaving behind equipment just to escape alive. Women, where present, faced their own dangers. In male-dominated camps they were vulnerable to exploitation and violence, with little recourse. Some ran boarding houses or worked in saloons, navigating a world where protection depended entirely on alliances with powerful men. The absence of law made abuse easy and accountability rare. Nighttime amplified fear. Darkness hid intentions. Footsteps outside a tent could mean theft or murder. Fires were kept low to avoid drawing attention. Men slept with weapons within reach, waking at the slightest sound. Dreams were shallow, interrupted constantly by the knowledge that safety was an illusion. Murders were rarely investigated. Bodies were found and buried quickly, if they were buried at all. Questions went unanswered. Grudges lingered. The lack of closure fed paranoia. Anyone could be next, anyone could be responsible. Violence also became internal. The constant readiness to defend oneself changed people. Men grew jumpy, aggressive, quick to assume the worst. The line between self-defense and cruelty blurred. Empathy eroded. In such an environment, kindness felt risky. The absence of law did not create freedom, it created constant tension. Every interaction carried the potential for conflict. Every disagreement held the possibility of escalation. Life became a series of calculations: when to speak, when to stay silent, when to show strength, when to back down. A single misjudgment could end everything. Some miners eventually left not because they failed to find gold, but because they could no longer endure the fear. The physical hardships were visible, but the psychological strain was just as damaging. Living without security, without predictability, without justice took a toll that many could not name, only feel. The Wild West has often been romanticized as a place of rugged independence, but independence without protection is simply exposure. The gold camps stripped away the illusions of civilization and revealed how thin they really were. Beneath them lay a brutal truth. Without structure, human conflict does not disappear, it intensifies. This was the reality of lawlessness in the goldfields. Not heroic shootouts or noble outlaws, but a grinding, constant threat that seeped into every aspect of daily life. Survival depended not on morality, but on vigilance. Not on fairness, but on force. And in that world, even those who avoided violence carried it with them, in their posture, their instincts, their inability to ever fully relax again. Loneliness did not arrive all at once. It seeped in gradually, unnoticed at first, like a cold draft through a poorly sealed tent. In the beginning, most miners believed isolation would be temporary. They told themselves they were only passing through this place, that once they struck gold, they would return home changed men. Letters would be written later, apologies would be made later. Everything meaningful was postponed for the future, tied to success that always seemed just one discovery away. But days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. Camps shifted. People came and went. Familiar faces disappeared without explanation. Some left quietly, some died. Others simply moved on to the next rumor of gold. Connections were fragile, constantly disrupted by movement and uncertainty. Just as a man began to recognize voices around him, they vanished. Communication with the outside world was painfully slow. Letters took months, if they arrived at all. Many never did. Roads were unreliable. Couriers were inconsistent. Entire seasons could pass without news from home. A miner might learn of a birth, a death, or a marriage long after it had already reshaped the lives of those he loved. Sometimes he learned nothing at all. And when letters did arrive, they were often devastating. Wives spoke of hardship, unpaid debts, children growing without fathers. Parents aged quickly, farms struggled, businesses failed. The miner read these words by firelight, far from anyone who could share the burden of them. He folded the paper carefully, placed it somewhere safe, and returned to work the next morning as if nothing had happened. The gold camps were full of people, yet profoundly empty. Men lived shoulder to shoulder, but rarely truly together. Conversations stayed shallow. Everyone guarded their inner lives. To reveal fear or regret felt dangerous, an admission of weakness. So men joked, boasted, exaggerated. They told stories of fortunes just around the corner, even when they no longer believed them themselves. At night the silence became unbearable. When work ended and distractions faded, thoughts rushed in. Memories of home sharpened. Faces grew clearer in the mind than anything in the present. Regret followed close behind. The question echoed constantly, was it worth it? And worse, what if it never would be? Some men talked to themselves, quietly at first, then openly. They muttered plans, rehearsed conversations, argued with imagined critics. Others formed attachments to routines with obsessive precision, clinging to order in a world that offered none. The pan must be washed exactly this way, the fire built exactly that way. The ritual mattered more than the outcome. Gambling flourished because it offered momentary connection. Card games gathered men around a shared focus, something to care about together. But gambling also destroyed what little stability remained. Men lost weeks of earnings in a single night. Tempers flared, accusations followed, fights broke out. The brief comfort of companionship ended in violence or bitterness. Alcohol deepened the isolation it promised to relieve. Drinking dulled the ache temporarily, but it widened the gap between men and the people they once were. Memories blurred, days slipped by uncounted. Drunken arguments replaced meaningful conversation. Many miners woke unsure how they had spent the night before, only aware that something else had been lost. The absence of women and families reshaped emotional lives in unhealthy ways. Affection had nowhere to go. Vulnerability had no safe outlet. Some men became emotionally numb, shutting down entirely. Others grew volatile, swinging between intense attachment and sudden rage. Relationships, when they formed, were often desperate and unstable. Mental breakdowns were common, though rarely named. Men withdrew, stopped speaking, stopped caring for themselves. They stared into space for long periods, barely reacting to their surroundings. Others grew paranoid, convinced that everyone around them was plotting theft or betrayal. Sleep deprivation worsened everything. Hallucinations were not uncommon after long periods of exhaustion and malnutrition. There was no language for mental health, no understanding that minds could be injured just like bodies. A man who broke down was labeled weak, lazy, or crazy. Sympathy was scarce. Survival required functionality, not compassion. Those who could not keep up were left behind, literally and figuratively. The constant pressure to endure created a culture where suffering was normalized. Complaining was shameful. Admitting despair was dangerous. Men learned to bury emotions deeply, even from themselves. Over time, this repression twisted inward, emerging as anger, recklessness, or total apathy. Some miners became obsessed with signs and superstitions. They believed certain days were lucky, certain tools cursed. A streak of bad luck was explained through omens rather than probability. This gave meaning to randomness, a sense of control in a world ruled by chance. When reality offered no reassurance, belief stepped in. Others fixated on the idea that quitting would invalidate everything they had endured. This was perhaps the most powerful trap of all. The longer a man stayed, the harder it became to leave. To walk away meant admitting that the years of suffering had been meaningless. It meant facing the possibility that the dream had been false from the beginning. This mental trap kept countless miners digging long past the point of reason. Even when bodies were failing, even when hope had thinned to almost nothing, they stayed. The gold rush was not sustained by optimism. It was sustained by sunk cost, by fear of regret, by the inability to imagine a different future. Homesickness became physical. It manifested as chest pain, fatigue, a constant sense of unease. Men dreamed of familiar places, fields, kitchens, voices, and woke with the crushing realization that they were still trapped in the same harsh landscape. Morning brought not renewal, but disappointment at having survived the night. The few moments of joy were fleeting. A shared laugh, a good meal, a brief letter. These moments stood out precisely because they were so rare. When they ended, the return to isolation felt even heavier. Hope became dangerous because it made the fall harder. As years passed, some miners no longer remembered what they were working toward. The idea of home faded into abstraction. They could not picture where they would go if they left. The camps, brutal as they were, became familiar. Leaving felt frightening, staying felt unbearable. Many remained suspended between the two, stuck by inertia alone. Identity eroded slowly. Men stopped thinking of themselves as sons, husbands, fathers, craftsmen. They became miners and nothing else. When that identity failed to deliver success, there was nothing left to fall back on. This hollowing out was subtle but devastating. Isolation also distorted morality. Without stable communities, shared values weakened. What mattered was immediate survival. Long-term consequences faded. Men did things they would have condemned in other circumstances: stealing, abandoning friends, ignoring suffering. Afterwards, they justified it as necessity. Some tried to fill the void with religion, holding impromptu services or private prayers. Faith offered structure, meaning, and the promise that suffering had purpose. For some, it helped. For others, unanswered prayers deepened despair. Silence from the heavens felt like confirmation that they were truly alone. There were men who simply disappeared. They walked away from camps and were never seen again. Some returned east quietly. Others wandered into the wilderness. A few took their own lives, unable to bear the weight any longer. These deaths were rarely discussed. They were folded into the general haze of loss and quickly forgotten. What remained were men who endured not because they were strong, but because they were trapped by hope, by pride, by fear, by exhaustion. Survival became automatic, stripped of meaning. Days blurred together, seasons passed unnoticed. Life narrowed to a single goal that grew less believable with every failure. The gold rush did not just test bodies. It dismantled minds. It eroded emotional resilience until men became shadows of themselves, moving through routines without purpose or joy. The loneliness was not just the absence of others. It was the absence of connection to one's own former life. And perhaps the cruelest part was that this suffering was invisible to history's myths. The stories remembered triumph and adventure, not the quiet despair of men sitting alone by dying fires, wondering how everything had gone so wrong. By the time many miners realized that the greatest cost of the gold rush was not physical hardship but psychological ruin, they no longer knew how to return to the people they once were. By the time the dream finally collapsed, it rarely did so with drama. There was no single moment when a miner stood up, brushed the dirt from his hands, and declared the chase over. Instead, the realization crept in slowly, almost imperceptibly, like erosion. A little hope washed away each day until nothing solid remained. What replaced it was not clarity but exhaustion, a deep, hollow fatigue that reached far beyond the body. Most miners never became rich. That fact alone dismantles the mythology of the gold rush more effectively than any statistic ever could. The popular image suggests a land of opportunity where effort translated into reward, where perseverance guaranteed success. In reality, gold followed no rules. It did not care how long a man had worked, how much he had sacrificed, or how badly he needed it. Luck determined outcomes far more than labor ever did. Studies of mining camps and historical records consistently reveal the same pattern. Only a tiny fraction of miners made lasting profits. Many found small amounts of gold, just enough to survive another week or month. Very few struck deposits large enough to change their lives. And even among those who did, success was often temporary. Gold was easy to lose, to theft, bad investments, gambling, or violence. For the majority, the balance sheet was grim. Years of labor yielded little more than worn-out bodies, damaged health, and memories they preferred not to revisit. Men arrived with savings and left with debt. Tools purchased on credit became burdens when claims failed. Supplies bought at inflated prices consumed any modest gains. The economics of the goldfields were quietly predatory, designed to extract value from labor without guaranteeing return. The real winners were rarely the ones knee-deep in rivers. They were the merchants who sold shovels, pans, boots, food, tents, and alcohol. They charged whatever the market would bear, knowing miners had no alternatives. Prices fluctuated wildly, always upward. A single egg might cost a day's wages. Flour, beans, and bacon were sold at margins unimaginable elsewhere. While miners gambled against chance, merchants dealt in certainty. Saloons thrived as well. They offered escape, however temporary, from grinding reality. They also reclaimed much of whatever gold miners managed to find. Wages turned into drinks. Drinks turned into fights. Fights turned into funerals. The cycle was profitable for everyone except the men at its center. Transportation companies, shipping firms, and land speculators also benefited. They sold passage west knowing many would never return richer. They sold claims of questionable value, maps that exaggerated promise, and services that preyed on optimism. The gold rush created entire industries devoted not to finding gold, but to feeding on the belief that gold was within reach. As the years passed, the landscape itself began to reflect the truth. Once bustling camps thinned out. Fires burned lower, tents collapsed and were not replaced. Tools rusted where they lay. When rumors of new discoveries faded or proved false, men moved on, leaving behind what they could no longer carry. Ghost towns spread across the West like scars. Buildings stood empty, windows broken, doors swinging in the wind. Streets that once echoed with shouting and laughter fell silent. Graves remained, often the most permanent structures in places meant to be temporary. These towns were not abandoned because they failed to exist. They were abandoned because they had served their purpose and consumed their people. For those who survived and left, returning home was rarely triumphant. Many arrived thinner, older, quieter. Families barely recognized them. Children had grown. Wives had adapted to life without them. Some returned with stories of hardship, but little to show for it. Others returned in shame, unable to explain years of absence that ended in failure. Reintegration was difficult. The rhythms of ordinary life felt strange after years of chaos. Patience had eroded. Trust was hard won and easily lost. Some men could not settle. They moved restlessly from job to job, town to town, unable to escape the habits formed in the camps. The gold fields had reshaped them permanently. Those who stayed in the West often transitioned into other forms of labor, railroads, ranching, logging, or new mining ventures. The pattern repeated itself in different forms: hard work, low security, high risk. The frontier absorbed men and kept moving, leaving little behind but progress built on suffering. History later softened the edges. Stories were simplified. The gold rush became a tale of ambition and bravery, of rugged individuals carving opportunity from wilderness. Paintings and books celebrated the lucky few who succeeded. The countless failures faded into footnotes or vanished entirely. But the truth lingered in the details historians could not ignore. Mortality rates in mining regions were high. Violence and disease were common. Economic mobility was far lower than advertised. The dream functioned less as a ladder and more as a filter, selecting for those who could endure immense hardship, not those who were most deserving. The gold rush also reshaped the American West in ways that carried long-term consequences. Indigenous communities were displaced or destroyed. Environments were permanently damaged by mining practices that poisoned rivers and stripped land bare. Boom and bust cycles left regions unstable for decades. The costs outlasted the profits by generations. What made the experience especially cruel was not just that it failed most participants, but that it convinced them failure was personal. Men blamed themselves for not working hard enough, not choosing the right spot, not arriving early enough. Rarely did they question the system itself. The dream was structured so that responsibility flowed downward, while profit flowed upward. In hindsight, the gold rush reveals a pattern that repeats throughout history. When opportunity is framed as limitless and success is inevitable, suffering becomes invisible. Those who fail are dismissed as unlucky or unworthy. Those who profit are celebrated as proof that the system works. For the miners there was no such abstraction. Their lives were the evidence. They lived the consequences directly, in aching joints, in missing friends, in years that could never be recovered. The promise of gold had consumed time, the one resource no one ever gets back. Some men did strike gold and escape. Their stories became legend precisely because they were rare. They survived a process that destroyed many others. Their success did not invalidate the suffering around them, it merely obscured it. By the end, what remained of the gold rush was not wealth evenly distributed, but experience unevenly remembered. The camps disappeared. The rivers ran on, the myths solidified, and beneath them lay the truth that most miners understood too late, that the chase itself was the trap. To be a gold miner in the Wild West was to live inside uncertainty, to exchange stability for possibility, and to discover that possibility does not guarantee mercy. It was to learn that freedom without security is its own kind of confinement, and that dreams sold at scale often demand payment in human cost. When the gold was gone, when the crowds moved on, and when silence settled over abandoned valleys, what lingered was not glory, but warning. When the dust settled and the last of the hopeful miners left the claims, a strange silence fell over the landscape. Ghost towns replaced bustling camps. Rusted tools lay where they had been abandoned. Shacks leaned against each other as if exhausted from the weight of years, their wooden walls warped and broken. Fires that had burned constantly, warming frozen hands and boiling water for meager meals, had long since gone out. The rivers, once scoured and churned by the relentless labor of thousands of men, flowed calmly again, indifferent to the toil and despair they had witnessed. For the men who survived, life after the gold rush was a test of adaptation, resilience, and reflection. Some returned east, but the world they left behind had moved on without them. Farms had been sold or neglected, families had grown without them, and towns had continued their lives in ways that left returning miners feeling like strangers in familiar places. The psychological impact of years spent in isolation, labor, and constant vigilance was immense. Many had forgotten the simple rhythms of normal life, meal times, casual conversation, or the comfort of steady shelter. These men carried with them an invisible burden, the weight of experiences that could not be washed away. Some attempted to rebuild their lives with what little they had left. A miner might return to a small town and try to farm again, but the body refused to cooperate. Years of labor in freezing water, swinging pickaxes, and hauling heavy loads had permanently altered muscles, joints, and bones. Back pain, arthritis, and chronic injuries were common, often forcing men into work they could no longer perform efficiently. Even those who had found modest amounts of gold were often physically weakened to the point where the treasure they had gained could not bring comfort or freedom. Others remained in the West, refusing to return to the world they had abandoned. They became ranchers, cowhands, or laborers on the new railroads that began to stretch across the continent. The skills honed in the goldfields, endurance, resourcefulness, and the ability to survive under harsh conditions, allowed them to adapt to other forms of grueling work. Yet even in these new endeavors, the ghosts of the gold rush lingered. Every creek and river seemed to whisper old memories. Every campfire brought back nights of freezing cold, hunger, and constant fear. Success in the West was not measured in wealth alone, but in the ability to endure, and these men carried the marks of that endurance both on their bodies and in their minds. For those who returned east, social reintegration posed its own challenges. The stories they brought back were often met with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Tales of rivers choked with mud, tents collapsing under snow, men drinking to stave off despair, and endless back-breaking labor were either exaggerated by imagination or dismissed as exaggeration by those who had remained safely behind. Families sometimes struggled to recognize the men who returned. Fathers were thinner, stooped, and quiet. Sons had become older than their age suggested, marked by experience that could not be undone. Wives and mothers often struggled to reconcile the men they remembered with the ones who returned. Emotional distance had grown during years of separation, and rebuilding intimacy took years, if it was possible at all. For some, the economic realities were harsher than the physical and emotional ones. Even miners who had succeeded in striking gold often spent their wealth quickly. Gold could be easily lost to theft, gambling, or bad investments. Others attempted to use it to start businesses or buy land, but many failed because they lacked experience in long-term financial management. Gold, after all, was a one-time prize, not a sustainable source of income. What it gave in immediate value, it often took away in the form of overconfidence and unpreparedness for the world beyond the mines. The environmental consequences of the gold rush became painfully apparent in the years that followed. Rivers and streams, once the lifeblood of the land, had been stripped of soil and vegetation. Dams and sluices diverted water and altered natural flows. Mercury, used to extract fine gold from dirt, leached into waterways and poisoned wildlife. Hillsides had been gouged and scarred. Trees had been felled for firewood, construction, and fuel for mining operations. The land, once resilient, was left vulnerable to erosion, flooding, and long-term ecological damage. The impact was both immediate and enduring, affecting generations of settlers who attempted to farm, ranch, or otherwise make use of the once promising territory. Social consequences were equally profound. Many regions saw rapid population booms followed by dramatic busts. Towns that had thrived on mining suddenly emptied, leaving behind empty streets, abandoned buildings, and a sense of desolation. Local economies collapsed when the miners left, creating waves of hardship for merchants, craftsmen, and service providers who had relied on the influx of wealth the miners represented. In this way, the gold rush was not just a personal story of hardship, but a societal phenomenon that reshaped entire regions. The gold rush also intensified cultural clashes and racial tensions. Immigrants who had arrived from China, Latin America, and Europe faced ongoing discrimination and hostility. Chinese miners in particular were often driven from claims by violence or legal manipulation, despite their willingness to work land considered unprofitable by others. Native Americans were displaced, massacred, or forced to relocate entirely, as mining operations encroached on their ancestral lands. The influx of miners created a society in which law was patchy, morality was situational, and violence was often the default solution. These patterns of exploitation, exclusion, and abuse left deep scars that would echo for decades. Yet even amid the suffering, some stories of resilience emerged. Men who survived carried with them a kind of wisdom and toughness that only such extremes could produce. They became teachers of survival, craftsmen, guides, and leaders in their communities. Their ability to endure harsh conditions, solve problems under pressure, and work tirelessly gave them an advantage in other frontier endeavors. In this way, the gold rush shaped a generation not just through failure, but through the hard lessons of experience. The psychological legacy of the gold rush cannot be overstated. Trauma, isolation, and constant fear altered personalities, sometimes permanently. Men who had endured years of relentless labor and life-threatening conditions developed patterns of hypervigilance, distrust, and emotional detachment. Relationships suffered, and many remained loners for the rest of their lives. Some carried post-traumatic stress without a name for it, their nights haunted by echoes of rivers, collapsing tents, and the faces of friends who had died. The mental scars were invisible, but no less real than broken bones or scarred hands. Economically, the gold rush left lessons that were often ignored at the time. It revealed the dangers of speculation, overconfidence, and reliance on chance rather than skill or planning. The dream of instant wealth motivated countless men to risk everything, but it also showed that dreams built on illusion can have devastating consequences. Financial literacy, strategic planning, and long-term investment were rarely part of the equation, and the absence of these concepts left many miners worse off than before they arrived. In retrospect, the gold rush was a microcosm of human ambition and folly. It demonstrated the extremes of hope and desperation, of courage and recklessness. It showed how people can endure unimaginable hardship for the promise of reward, and how systems of inequality and exploitation magnify suffering. The rush for gold transformed the West physically, socially, and culturally, leaving legacies that remain visible to this day. Some of the wealth generated by the gold rush did indeed fund progress. Railroads, towns, and infrastructure benefited indirectly from the labor and gold extracted from the land. Entrepreneurs who had survived or profited reinvested in communities. Yet for every story of success, there were countless tales of loss, abandonment, and unfulfilled dreams. The gold rush, like much of history, was both creation and destruction, a duality that must be understood in full to appreciate its true impact. Historians today often emphasize the lessons of the gold rush beyond its economic and environmental consequences. It teaches about human psychology, the allure of sudden opportunity, the dangers of herd mentality, and the ways people rationalize suffering in pursuit of a goal. It teaches about resilience, the remarkable capacity of humans to endure extreme conditions, and about vulnerability, the cost of dreams built without preparation. It teaches that history is rarely clean, neat, or heroic. It is messy, painful, and profoundly human. Even now, the gold rush continues to capture imagination. Stories are retold in books, films, and documentaries. Yet the reality of the miners' lives, the cold, hunger, isolation, violence, and loss, remains more compelling and more tragic than the myth. It reminds us that behind every legend lies countless untold stories of suffering and survival, and that the human cost of ambition is often invisible in history's popular narratives. For the men who lived it, the gold rush was not a tale of adventure or freedom. It was an odyssey of endurance, a test of physical, emotional, and mental limits. It was a world where hope and despair were intertwined, where each day offered both the possibility of fortune and the certainty of hardship. And in the end, most walked away carrying scars that no amount of gold could ever erase. In telling their stories today, we do more than recount dates, locations, and discoveries. We honor the people whose lives were shaped by forces beyond their control, whose courage, suffering, and perseverance continue to echo through time. We learn from their mistakes, their triumphs, and their resilience. And perhaps most importantly, we remember that history is not only about what was found, but about what was lost, what was endured, and what was left behind. The gold rush teaches us that fortune is fleeting, that labor does not always lead to reward, and that the pursuit of dreams can have profound consequences. It reminds us that human ambition is both beautiful and brutal, capable of inspiring extraordinary achievements and inflicting deep suffering. It is a lesson as relevant today as it was in 1848, a warning and a testament to the complexity of life, work, and survival in an unforgiving world. Even now, as we walk along the rivers of California or trace the hills of Nevada and Montana, the echoes of the past remain. The scars of miners' toil are etched into the landscape, into the rivers, and into the very soil. Ghost towns stand as silent witnesses to lives lived and dreams chased. The gold rush may have ended long ago, but the lessons it left behind endure. Reminders of the human cost of ambition, the fragility of hope, and the resilience of those who dared to chase it. And so, when we look back on the lives of these men, we must see more than the glitter of gold. We must see the hunger, the cold, the violence, the loneliness, the sickness, and the unyielding struggle that defined their existence. We must understand that history is not measured only in riches gained or lost, but in the endurance of the human spirit, and in the stories of those who survived, even when they never truly succeeded. The gold rush in all its beauty and horror remains a cautionary tale. It reminds us that the pursuit of wealth and opportunity comes with a price, often invisible until it has already been paid. It reminds us that perseverance without preparation can be ruinous, and that hope, while necessary, can also be cruel. And it reminds us, finally, that the human cost of history is never to be forgotten. The survivors of the gold rush carried its lessons with them for the rest of their lives. Some rebuilt, some wandered, some retold their stories. But all bore the invisible marks of years spent in the unforgiving West, a world of endless labor, fleeting rewards, and lessons carved deeply into flesh, mind, and spirit. Their story is not one of triumph alone, nor of tragedy alone, but of the complexity of the human experience when ambition meets reality, and when dreams are weighed against the harshest truths of life. And in remembering them, we honor not only their endurance, but the truths of a time when hope was both a motivator and a trap, when gold glittered like promise but cost more than any man could have imagined, and when the Wild West was not a land of freedom, but a crucible that tested every ounce of human strength, courage, and resilience. And so, story of the gold rush isn't one of instant fortune or endless adventure. It's a story of sweat, suffering, and shattered dreams. A harsh reminder that history is rarely as glamorous as the legends suggest. This journey into the past gave you a new perspective on the lives of those who toiled for every glimmer of gold. Make sure to like this video, share it with fellow history lovers, and subscribe to the channel for more stories that uncover the truths behind the myths. Until next time, remember, history is more than dates and places. It's the people who lived it.